Good afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Lincoln, and I'm from the Minnesota Legislative Reference Library. I'd like to welcome you to the second webinar sponsored by the Legislative Research Librarian Staff section of NCSL. Melanie Harshman from Texas and I are excited to tell you about a project our libraries have undertaken in the past several years, developing a database of information about the legislators who have served in our states, and to leave you with some thoughts if you hope to create a similar database. But first, I'd like to thank NCSL for giving us the opportunity to share our insights with our colleagues across the United States and Canada. Each state is structured in a unique way, but in communicating with our legislative librarian colleagues and with other legislative staff in other states, we are always struck by the similarities. Webinars are another venue for legislative staff to share with one another, and one that can occur despite bad weather or travel restrictions. Melanie and I will tell you about the databases in each of our states. As a visual reminder, the background of each slide will be an image of the Capitol Dome from the state we are discussing. Texas has a star in the center, as seen above, and Minnesota's is primarily blue. Both Melanie and I will be happy to answer questions at the end of our presentation. Not every legislative library would be the likely legislative office to track former legislators. It's the case in Minnesota and several other states. Minnesota and Texas's legislator databases are two of the most well-developed databases. Minnesota's has been over 20 years in the making. Texas's legislator database has been a more recent endeavor. Although it has taken a lot of time over the years, most of the work has been done as time permits. So, where did we start? Staff at the Minnesota Legislative Reference Library started talking about developing a database of legislators over 20 years ago. The Minnesota Historical Society had published a simple list of legislators from territorial days through 1971, compiled by a man named W.F. Tensing. As you can see from the cover of the book shown on the slide, it had a very long name, so library staff have always referred to the book as just Tensing. Of course, Tensing became incomplete as soon as the next election was held. The library began keeping a card file with a card for each legislator starting with the 1972 election. The blue cards, as we refer to them, had only the most basic information, as you can see from the slide. Tensing's facts were frequently unreliable, but much less so than our own blue cards. A different staff person produced the cards each election, and the information recorded was not very consistent or very thorough. Although we carefully tracked changes brought about by redistricting, we weren't very diligent about updating other information about legislators. The card file was vulnerable, too. A card could be easily removed or misfiled. We needed to double-check other sources every time we were asked about a particular legislator. Questions about former legislators were a regular part of our work, so we continued to discuss developing a database. It wasn't until it became possible for the database to be searchable on the web that we really began working on the project in earnest. Flawed as Tensing and the blue cards were, entering the data from these two sources was our first step in creating our database. After entering all the information from the blue cards and Tensing, we systematically worked our way through official legislative sources. We began with the legislative manuals. They are the single most important source for our database. The biographical entries provide birth dates, occupations, education, residence, and family information for each legislator. We began with the current legislators, and we worked our way backwards. Less information is included in the earlier volume. The 1871 Legislative Manual, for example, contains the name, age, district number, city of residence, occupation, and marital status. The roster also contains two other pieces of information that are not included in current legislative manuals: birthplace and the name of the hotel in St. Paul where they stay during session. Birthplaces listed in 1871 were more often Northern European than from the United States. The House and Senate journals were also crucial official sources. The journals allow us to confirm leadership positions, swearing-in dates, names, spelling, etc. The journals also contain tributes to legislators who have died, yielding additional biographical information. Non-legislative sources are important too. Birth and death certificate databases and census records have been very useful. In Minnesota, nearly every county had a county history published at the turn of the century. These county histories often have biographical entries for prominent citizens of the day, many of whom were legislators. The bios include useful information not included in those early, bare-bones legislative manuals. Newspaper clippings, both in our files and from other online newspaper sources, have been invaluable. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune has given us permission to post obituaries for every legislator. Sometimes it's the Star-Tribune staff who thank us for making that information available. People are important sources too. Legislators, both current and past, contact us with additional information. During lengthy floor sessions at the end of the legislative session, we frequently hear from legislators who want us to add information about them. They ask, "Did you know I just got a master's from the Kennedy School of Government?" And finally, one of the surprising things we found out is how many people find our database and provide us with other details about their relatives. As the Minnesota Legislator Database developed, library staff began to work with other offices in order to connect the biographical legislator information to other legislative information. We had assigned a number to all current and former legislators. Staff in other offices had inconsistent schemes and were willing to adopt the same legislator numbering system. The legislator database utilized the session numbering system that the revisor's office was using. These consistent systems allow all offices to link information together. I'll show you some of the ways that works. Here's an example. This is the bill status screen for a bill introduced in 2007. The chief author of this bill, prohibiting legislators from lobbying for a year after leaving legislative service, is Representative Steve Swigum. He's no longer a legislator, but his name in the author field links back to his legislator database record. Likewise, the legislator database record links back to the bills in the bill status system that Representative Swigum authored. One of the features of the Minnesota Legislator Database is information about each session in which a legislator served. Each session entry includes a link to bills authored, committees, leadership positions, and an official picture if available. The link to session details links to the library's time capsule page. Here's a link to the legislative time capsule for the year 1969. In this case, the library has pulled together information from other legislative offices, from statistical lists the library has compiled about party control, about leaders, about vetoes, and information from the legislator database to give a researcher a good sense of the legislature at a point in time. Staff at the Minnesota Legislative Library also worked with other agencies to get digital images added to the legislator's record. The picture on the left is of Representative Albert Tuttle. The Minnesota Historical Society allowed library staff to add the beautiful images of the first legislators elected following statehood. The images are part of the Historical Society's Visual Resources database. The picture on the right is of Representative Myrtle Cain, one of the first 4 women elected in 1923. The library benefited from being part of several digitization projects of the Minnesota Digital Library. The official photos of legislators were scanned from 8 editions of the Minnesota Legislative Manual and added to the biographies. In terms of database development, we began talking about this project in 1989. We began by filling out sheets of paper that had the fields we thought we'd want in our database. Our database began as an Access database and became available on the web in November of 2006. It was eventually moved to a SQL server in 2009. Including the legislators newly elected a few weeks ago, we have 5,219 legislators. If your state is considering establishing a legislator database, you may want to consider using the work of another state to help you get started. One of the biggest challenges in Minnesota is how to address conflicting information. We find information in official sources at odds with information in other official sources, birth dates, names, spellings, birthplace. We try to verify in secondary sources when possible and document what we've checked so we don't redo our work later on. Room for explanatory notes is imperative. We'll talk about this more later. I mentioned earlier that current and former legislators are frequent contributors to Minnesota's legislator database. They can also be a challenge. We regularly have legislators asking us to remove information, such as their religion or the names of their children, information that is widely available on other sites, including their own campaign sites. We comply in most cases. Minnesota had nonpartisan elections from 1913 through the early 1970s. Everyone knows that, and yet people still want to know the political party of the members. Legislators caucused as conservatives or liberals, Yet those designations did not necessarily align with a particular political party. And there weren't just two political parties. There were several smaller political parties too. It's complicated. Library staff add notes to the legislator's record whenever we find something that connects a member of the Conservative caucus with the Republican Party or some other party. Minnesota has a long history of contested elections and recounts. Our gubernatorial race and 3 legislative races are currently in recount. As we've worked down the database, we've uncovered a fair number of elections in which newly elected legislators are sworn in, but their right to a seat is contested and someone else is seated a few weeks later. County lines are also very problematic. These 2 maps show our county problem visually. One of the questions we get asked by current legislators is, who has represented my county over time? We have problems with counties like Andy Johnson County that no longer exist. But even with those that still do exist, determining who represented a county over time can be tricky. Take Dakota County, for example. Minnesota currently has 87 counties, but during territorial days, we had just 9. Dakota County is a suburban county south of St. Paul that existed prior to statehood, but the boundaries have changed since 1849. It once covered the width of the state and into what is now South Dakota. We still haven't figured out how to resolve this issue. Now let's hear from Melanie about the development of Texas's legislator database.
Thank you, Elizabeth. My name is Melanie Harshman with the Texas Legislative Reference Library, and I'm so pleased to be here today. In Texas, the library had a member card file, much like Minnesota, generated by library staff sometime before 1967. Obituaries were even taped to some of the cards, as you can see here in this photo. In 1967, manuals and journals were used to update and create the cards for each member. It does not contain very early legislators. In the beginning, Texas also had a 2-volume set published by the Secretary of the Senate's office, Members of the Texas Congress, 1836 to 1845, and Members of the Texas Legislature, 1846 to 1992, which was a key source. We also had member rosters and biographical lists from the House and Senate in our vertical files, and various publications like the Texas Almanac, Texas State Directory, and Texas Legislative Manual. Texas has the following basic fields of information for each member in our database. Just to highlight a few, in our name fields we included a nickname. We have some pretty colorful nicknames in Texas, like Robert McAlpin Williamson, known as Three-Legged Willie. We also have a variant name field to include alternate spellings of last names. We have an ethnicity field, but this one is not published due to privacy. On party affiliation, we document changes in the party from news articles and press releases. We also track leadership roles, including the Speaker, Speaker Pro Tem, and Dean of the Senate. And for committee membership, we note chairs, vice chairs, so we can see leadership in the committees over time. And finally, we have a notes field, which is where we can record interesting information, discrepancies in the name or birth and death date, and notes about the member's home city and county. Minnesota's required fields are similar. Our research here in Texas began with official legislative sources such as legislative journals and manuals. We used the House and Senate journal proceedings quite extensively, and also the Texas Legislative Manual published by the legislature since 1879, containing legislative rosters, home city and county, and party affiliation. We have also added several kinds of resolutions about members. First, we identified memorial resolutions about former members of the legislature, which provide a wealth of biographical information and colorful details, such as a 1903 memorial for Senator James McDonald, which stated he was a Democrat whose sword was ever drawn in defense of his party. In recent years, we've also begun adding congratulatory, honorary, and birthday resolutions, which also provide important and sometimes humorous insights. For example, this resolution here on your screen from the House Journal 1967 congratulates Representative Cletus A. Davis, also known as Cowboy Davis, on his 37th birthday, and notes his service as a guinea pig for drinking 105 ounces of bourbon in 30 minutes in order to help the House Criminal Jurisprudence Committee determine the legal definition of intoxicated. Over the years, we have also added genealogy and other electronic resources outside the legislative arena. We use the census and other genealogy resources quite extensively, including RootsWeb, Ancestry.com, and Heritage Quest. Heritage Quest is a ProQuest database available through our Texas State Library's TextShare database resource sharing program, and includes images of the census from 1790 to 1930, and a wonderful online collection of family and county histories. In particular, the 1900 census is quite helpful since the census takers asked what month and year a person was born. Occupational resources can also be a treasure trove of information on legislators, especially members who served for a short time. For example, for members of our legislature who were also attorneys, we identified Texas Bar Journal memorials of the State Bar of Texas and culled our collection by reading each and every issue. These are sometimes the only source available on a particular member. Historical resources are also crucial, such as the Handbook of Texas Online by the Texas State Historical Association, County Histories, and TextGenWeb, an online genealogy community from each of the 154 counties in the state, providing vital records and cemetery information. The library has compiled newspaper clippings on members of the legislature and legislative topics since the early 1900s, and we also use newspaperarchive.com extensively, available by subscription. In particular, the Galveston Daily News has been essential to us for reports of early sessions and legislative elections. Finally, we have just begun to receive family donations and input. We just launched our database in September, and 3 weeks later received a package of information from a local Central Texas genealogist. We also have received from family members a map showing the scene of an 1857 gunfight involving State Senator A.G. Walker from a family member in Ohio. In Texas, we've also attempted to connect as many resources as possible relating to former members. In the members record, we have provided links to our clipping service archive, links to the bills authored by that member, and links to committees and legislative reports of those committees. We can best see these links through an example record from our database. This is an example record for the late Representative Irma Rangel from Clayburgh County in South Texas. In addition to the photo, biographical information, and terms of service, we use footnotes to explain special elections, party changes, discrepancies in home, city, or county. To connect the member's record with other electronic resources of the library, we provide links in the top right corner to committee information and legislation. This is the second half of Representative Rangel's database record, showing other biographical resources such as newspaper clippings, honorary and memorial resolutions, photographs, and other articles or biographical sketches. Finally, on the record we display the committee information, which shows committee appointments made during the session and interim, and any committee leadership positions, and notes about changes in the committee membership. This is a screenshot of, if you click on the legislation link, which goes to our legislative archive system, an ongoing project here at the library to digitize legislative bill files in Texas, currently available back to 1949. When we add a primary author to the bill in the legislative archive system, the link also shows up in the members database. This is the link from the members record to our legislative reports database, which includes interim committee studies and reports on substantive legislative issues back to the first Texas legislature in 1846. Here is an example of the committee record and the PDF image of the report from the House Border and International Affairs Committee in 2004. This shows the list of articles from our newspaper clippings archive, which is available to legislative staff in the Texas Capitol complex for members who have passed away. Outside the Capitol, the public can see a list of the articles. We've also started a photo archive in our database. Most of these are official photos provided as a profile photo on our member records, but members of the legislature and family can submit other photos for inclusion. We have a couple of staff with the capability to store and upload photos. We also coordinate with offices in the House and Senate and the Texas State Preservation Board to add more photos to our collection. A former House of Representatives member and parliamentarian, Terry Keel, donated these photos to the library for our new photo archive. these give a window to history as well, such as this photo at the bottom right of the Speaker and 2 new parliamentarians in May 2007, amidst a debate on the powers of the Speaker after the previous parliamentarian resigned. In terms of database development here in Texas, it took us 9 years from concept to public access. We began our research going through memorial resolutions was our first project, and data entry in spring 2001, and the database was initially in Microsoft Access. It migrated to MySQL in 2002. Our bill information in the Legislative Archive system is contained in a separate SQL Server database. We provide access through a web-based interface using Cold Fusion, and both the data and the application are constantly revised by LRL staff who build and maintain the system. Currently, we have 5,469 legislators in our database after the recent elections. There are also different levels of database access and notes in our system. For access, a few librarians and administrative staff have full access to add, edit, delete notes or sources, or add new members come election time. Reference librarians have a more limited staff access to view records. Staff view also shows ethnicity and clips on each member. We can also add notes for the public or just for the staff. We use staff notes for things like member not returning or adding a biography from a campaign website. Finally, copyright. For items still in copyright or obtained through a database like Heritage Quest or Newspaper Archive, we have an internal PDF that we can provide upon request for patrons. We went through a very deliberate and long process to tag sources that were still in copyright. In Texas, we've had several challenges as well. First, Senate terms. In Texas, state senators serve 4-year terms, and we are in regular session every 2 years. So in most cases, we have linked 2 sessions together to form a 4-year term. The interesting part comes with redistricting. Under the Texas Constitution, a new Senate shall be chosen after every apportionment, and the senators elected after each apportionment shall be divided by lot into 2 classes. This means the Senate has to do a drawing for terms. So this involved finding the date in our Senate journals that the senators drew for terms, whether 2-year or 4-year, and applying the information to the members in the database. We also have members who were elected but never served in a legislative session due to death or resignation. For example, Glenda Dawson in the House passed away in September 2006, too late to be removed from the ballot. We made a decision many years ago that we wanted to show these members since they were actually elected to that session. So we used the date of election as their beginning date, and the ending date is the day they died, resigned, or assumed another office. Also a consideration were members elected in the interim between legislative sessions who did not serve in a session on the floor. We wanted to incorporate them. For instance, Patty Keel served from June 1996 to January 1997. She was elected and sworn in the interim but never served in a legislative session. Special elections have also been a challenge. When we began, there was no single list of special election dates prior to 1992. We created one with the help of the Secretary of State Elections Division. Special elections make everything more complicated. The number of freshmen, the party affiliation, resignation letters, special election dates. Party affiliation and changes have also been a challenge. Political party affiliation prior to 1900 in Texas has been quite a challenge. We are attempting to confirm with sources positively what each person's party was through newspaper articles, biographies, and rare legislative manuals we can find from this period. Party changes are also problematic. We have 1 term assigned to each member. If they change parties in the midst of a term, we mark the change in the notes, citing sources like newspaper articles or press releases. Finally, Texas history from 1846 to 1876 is quite complicated. There were 6 Texas constitutions during this time, as you can see here. The Senate districts were redrawn 7 times in this period as well. In particular, the Reconstruction period in Texas after the Civil War was quite tumultuous, with members failing or refusing to qualify for the legislature in many election contests. The Reconstruction Constitution of 1869 also provided for 6-year terms for senators and annual sessions of the legislature. And now we will look at initiatives in other states to create legislator databases. A number of states have expanded their list of legislators to a robust database, including Colorado, Nevada, Kansas, and Hawaii. These complex databases can provide simple biographical information about an individual legislator, the ability to search for the answer to a particular question, or the ability to capture statistics about a legislative session. Here we can see Colorado's and Nevada's legislator records, showing biographical information and years of service, among other details. Basic lists of members of the legislature can give you a framework for adding details. Lists can help you and your state to determine what information is crucial. For example, various forms of names, district numbers, political party affiliation, or occupation. There are several advantages to pulling these fields of information together in a database and developing more than a list. First, a searchable database can provide context for laws, political movements, and the like. Second, databases provide information that is unique or hard to come by, such as lists of committees over time. In Texas, when we began our member database, no source prior to 1991 existed to show committee chairs and membership. The committee piece of our database is now heavily used around committee appointment time and also by legislative staff when they draft resolutions honoring or memorializing members. Finally, while constructing a complex database is a considerable investment of valuable staff and time resources, it ends up saving time in the long run. In both of our states, we can now easily answer questions using our databases, such as in Minnesota, who has represented Stearns County since statehood, or how many legislators have been doctors. In Texas, we recently used our database to provide statistics on the number of new House members, including a record number of new Republican House members. The research questions posed to both our libraries have also become more complex, linking concepts people wouldn't have thought of before, such as, in Minnesota, when was the last time a Judiciary Committee chair was not an attorney? Or in Texas, how many vice chairs of House Appropriations were from border counties? These queries are now at our fingertips. Elizabeth, I'll turn it back over to you for a discussion of database searching.
In Minnesota, we've set up the ability to search our database a number of different ways, corresponding to the questions we are often asked. Legislators by session, county represented, occupation, military service are all heavily used searches. Texas has similar searches. Both Minnesota and Texas frequently do customized searches for legislators, citizens, reporters, and political science professors. A rich source for supplementary information can be other legislative offices. In Minnesota, like Texas, we were able to obtain many years of official legislative photographs in digital format from the House and Senate photographers. We were also able to download and link to older televised legislator interviews. House and Senate television staff feature the television interviews of current members on their site. Older interviews or interviews with former legislators are available from Minnesota's legislator database. Seating charts are also available electronically. Again, the House and Senate provide a link to the current version, and our database has older versions. The factual information we collect on legislators isn't always straightforward. It is important to be able to account for discrepancies within the database. Birth and death dates are surprisingly thorny. In Minnesota, earlier legislative manuals listed legislators' ages rather than birth dates. It isn't always possible to find dates for long-gone legislators, and current legislators may be reluctant to share the information. In Texas, if a death date is disputed, they opt for the date on the tombstone. It's chiseled in stone. Name variations are problematic too. Many times the name is spelled one way in one official source, another way in another official source, and a third way in newspaper clippings. A variant name field is helpful, so each name is searchable. In Minnesota, we make note of facts contributed by family members. Recently, we had the grandson of a former legislator correct the gender of one of the legislator's children. A record indicated that the legislator had 2 sons and a daughter named Dana. The grandson informed us that Dana, his father, was not a daughter. Our notes indicate that another family member had contributed the information. We're not sure if there was miscommunication or if this was a practical joke. In Minnesota, we've even had a former legislator question the date we list for her party change. Because all the news sources corroborate the date we have listed, we chose to just make a note of her date in our notes field. Note fields are crucial. In both states, we present all the information found and try to make the best choice with the most official legislative sources. It's not just a question of 2 out of 3 sources having the right answer. Every case is different, and we collaborate as a staff quite frequently on how to handle discrepancies. An example in Texas is Texas's William M. Buckskin Williams. 2 biographies say he served in the 1855 Senate. However, journals show he was in the House. In closing, we'd like to share some interesting stories we have found along the way in developing our databases. Melanie?
In Texas, we've had several interesting stories come up. One is of Representative Louis Franke, who was robbed and murdered on the Capitol steps February 19, 1873. This is the old Texas Capitol. Franke was murdered on that day in February, and we found a county biography from the Record of Southwest Texas indicating that, quote, during a session of the legislative body, just after Mr. Franke had received his pay and was walking down the steps of the old Capitol building, he was assassinated by some persons unknown, it is supposed for his money, end quote. However, the story got more interesting. According to the Galveston Daily News, Louis Franke was headed to the land office where the Committee on Immigration, of which he was a chairman, was to meet. And the paper says, after Franke was found at the foot of the Capitol steps, quote, in answer to questions who he was, the man replied, "My name is Louis Franke. I'm a member of the House of Representatives, and a member of the committee struck me on the head with a stick," end quote. We also have House Journal proceedings of Franke's funeral ceremony performed in the House of Representatives, where his body lay in state. We've also found some famous relatives. In addition to the more well-known relatives, such as Samuel Ely Johnson, the father of LBJ, we've also discovered that we have our own Patrick Henry. Representative Patrick Henry from Wichita Falls, Texas, served in the House in 1913. And according to a biography in A History of Texas and Texans, he was a descendant of the famous orator. And his father, A.S. Henry, also served as a representative from Navarro County. Richard Bosch, a senator from the 1st and 2nd legislature, was the grandson of Benjamin Franklin. This is an interesting story because Bosch was born in Philadelphia in 1784. He married Sophia Burrell Dallas, the daughter of the U.S. Treasury Secretary and sister of the U.S. Vice President, and they had 9 children. However, in 1836, he abandoned his family, possibly for financial reasons, and traveled to Texas, where he served on the ship Zavala in the Texas Navy. He continued his Navy service and later was enrolling clerk of the House of Representatives in the 3rd Congress of the Republic. We've also had some district switching. We discovered a Representative Edgar P. Haney who moved from Wichita to Fort Worth in the 1913 to 15 session and thus was elected to 2 different House districts.
In St. Paul, Minnesota, Representative Joe Roulette is a cult hero. During territorial days, he kidnapped the bill that would have moved the capital from St. Paul to the small town of St. Peter and holed up in a hotel until it was too late for the governor to sign it. He also is one of several non-residents who served in the Minnesota legislature. He represented Pembina, a part of the territory of Minnesota, but no longer part of the state of Minnesota once the Constitution was adopted. It was assumed that Roulette would cease to be a Minnesota legislator. However, A History of Minnesota reported when the legislature met in 1857, behold, here was Joe Roulette with his credentials as usual, and of course he was admitted. Perhaps he was allowed to stay because he had walked all 385 miles from Pembina to St. Paul for the first day of session. Even less believable is the legislator who wasn't even a U.S. citizen. Representative E. Allen Powers was a Canadian who served in the first legislative session with Joe Roulette. A History of Olmsted County states he served as a legislator without going through the formality of becoming a citizen of the United States, but in that early day, who cared? Representative John Pillsbury Snyder was a survivor of the sinking of the Titanic on April 15, 1912. He and his wife, as newlyweds, were allowed to be together in lifeboat number 7. He was the grandson of the governor and from a prominent Minnesota milling family. The oddest thing we found yet is that there was an election held and none of those elected were sworn in. Due to the protracted legislative session of 1857 and 58, the 1858 to 59 meeting of the legislature was deemed unnecessary. As a result, those elected in October of 1858 were never sworn in. This little known fact caused us a lot of confusion until we figured it out. I'd like to give a big thanks to Melanie and her colleagues at the Texas Legislative Reference Library and to my colleagues at the Minnesota Legislative Reference Library, especially Paul Van Kira and Mike Schatz, for all the work they've put in over the years on these rich sources of biographical information. Nearly everyone on the Minnesota staff has contributed to this project at some point in the last 20 years.
Yes, and I would also like to offer my sincere thanks to all of my colleagues at the Texas Legislative Reference Library, especially Nancy Watson, Catherine Wisterhausen, and Janet Burka for all of their contributions the last 9 years as we have developed this project, and to our director, Mary Camp, for her support. Thank you so much for listening to our stories today, and we'd be more than happy to take your questions.
Thank you. The floor is now open for questions. If you do have a question, please press *1 on your telephone keypad at this time. Questions will be taken in the order they were received. If at any time your question has been answered, you can remove yourself from the queue by pressing 1. If you're using a speakerphone, we ask that while posing your question, you pick up your handset to provide favorable sound quality. Again, ladies and gentlemen, if you do have a question or comment, please press *1 on your telephone keypad at this time. And you must be able to use the chat box located in the lower right-hand side of your screen. Simply type your message into the box and click send. And please hold while we poll for questions.
Well, there's one, this is Elizabeth, there's already one question from Marguerite Beveridge. She asked, when a legislator asks that information be deleted or the information left blank, do you include a statement such as legislator declines to state? In Minnesota, if it's unofficial information and they've asked us to remove it, such as birth date, we nearly always comply. If it's official information, like a committee that they've served on, we've never actually been asked that, but we would decline to remove that information. But something like birth date or names of children, we are here to serve them, and we remove it. However, we put notes in our in the notes field that the public can't see to document that in case it's helpful for another question down the line. Melanie, what about Texas?
In Texas, we recently released our database in September of this year, so we actually haven't had this specific instance happen yet where someone's requested that we remove something, but I feel quite sure that we would comply because we are here to help the members and to help them in their research. So, in addition, we would also note things in the note discrepancies in the notes if there was a conflict on the date.
Leslie Polsom from Canada asked, is it possible to have access to our slides? And yes, this is being recorded and will be available on the librarian, the LRL staff section of the NCSL website. I'm not sure how long it takes to get placed there, but they will be available.
I'd be happy to share access to the slides if anyone who's interested.
Same here.
Thank you, ma'am. And we do have some questions that come over the phone. Can we take them at this time?
Sure.
Great. Our first question comes from Elaine Apostola from Maine State Law and Legislator. Please state your question.
Hi, I'm Elaine Apostola from the Maine State Law and Legislative Reference Library. And actually, you just answered my question. I would like to get copies of your slides also. And thank you for a great presentation.
Sure. Oh, thanks.
Thank you very much. And our next question comes from Tracy Kimball. Go ahead, Tracy.
Hi, I'm from New Mexico, and thank you for a wonderful presentation. What I haven't figured out for our database is how to deal with spouses' names, particularly because they change and we don't necessarily know about it. What do you guys do?
In Minnesota, we often we pay close attention to that because it can be thorny, and if it's included in the legislative directory, we include that. If that information is no longer provided, we will often put in parentheses as of a certain date. We kind of handle it on a case-by-case basis.
In Texas, Tracy, we don't have a field for spouse's name, and we haven't collected that information. And we also don't collect children's names, so we haven't crossed that bridge yet.
Val Foots asked versus on the chat room is data provided as a web service. And I'm assuming, Val, that you are asking whether it's available publicly on the web. If that's the case, yes. Our everything other than the sort of private staff notes is available to the public and to anyone.
Ours is also available to the public. We have a couple of exceptions. We cannot display the newspaper clippings outside the Capitol complex for copyright reasons. But and then we also have some sources that we cannot display outside also because of copyright. And then we have some staff notes that are not displayed to the public, but pretty much everything else will be there. And it's called Texas Legislators Past Present on our website.
Okay, thank you very much. And go ahead.
Oh, and Minnesota's is Minnesota Legislators Past and Present. And let us know if that didn't answer your question, Val.
Okay, thank you, Pam. I'd like to remind the audience that if you do have a question, please press star 1 on your telephone keypad now. And ma'am, I don't see any further questions on the phone or on the web at this time.
Great. Well, thank you all for listening to our stories today, and we're really happy to tell you about our work on these important databases. So thanks again.
Thank you all for your participation. We enjoyed it.
Ma'am, we actually got one late question over the phone.
Oh, great.
Could we care to take it? Okay, thank you.
Sure.
It comes from Kathy Martin. Go ahead, Kathy.
Hi guys, it's Kathy Martin from North Carolina, and thank you for a wonderful presentation. Sorry I was late at the buzzer. You know, I would not be any good at no good at Jeopardy. But you mentioned, I think both of you started in Access. I remember at least Minnesota started in Access, and maybe Texas still is. I'm not sure. And then Elizabeth, I know you guys moved to SQL, and you said the Access forms are still available. So. So were you saying that you would be willing to provide those forms or provide the programming to other libraries that would like to get started that way?
I think we have provided that. Yes, we'd be happy to advise you on anything and give you the framework for developing it yourself. So there's no problem, and I think we've actually done that for a couple of people.
We actually do in Texas, we do our data entry and all of our editing in a Cold Fusion application now. So I'm not sure if we still would have the Access forms, but I could definitely check on that for you, Kathy, and let you know.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot.